Bismillahirrahmanirrahim. Alhamdulillah wahda. Wassalatu wassalamu ala man la nabiyya ba'da. Amma ba'd. Ladies and gentlemen, friends and elders, brothers and sisters, Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh. I thank you all for attending and expressing your interest in today's debate. The topic is the Satanic verses, fabricated or authentic. What are the Satanic verses? What is the background to them? Satanic verses are certain verses which are wrongfully attributed to Prophet Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam. They do originate in Islamic literature, like many other things which originate in Islamic literature, and they don't have any origin with the Prophet himself. What is the background story to this particular instance? Background story is once in the 5th year of the prophethood of Prophet Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam, he was in the Kaaba, in the sanctuary of Mecca, and he had a desire to compromise with the religion of the disbelievers of Quraysh, those who were idol worshippers. He had a desire to compromise with them, and he did compromise with them, and at the same time, according to the story, at the same time, Surah number 53 was revealed. And while he was reciting the surah, when he got to the verse number 19 and 20, the devil, the Satan, interjected or interpolated certain verses within the contents of the surah on the tongue of Prophet Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam. And the verses read, if we were to read verses from chapter number 53, verse number 19, have you seen Lat and Uzza and another, the third, and Manat? And then the devil, the Satan, interjected these words, and I quote, these are the high-flying ones whose intercession is to be hoped for. So allegedly, these words, which I just quoted, were interpolated, added, inserted within the contents of the Quran on the tongue of Prophet Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam or in his mind, and consequently Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam, he expressed these words in public, and the pagans of Quraysh were very pleased by this. They saw a clear compromise with their doctrine, and by the end of the surah, when Prophet prostrated, his companions prostrated, and so did the disbelievers. And the disbelievers stated, this is all we wanted. We wanted some sort of compromise. Now, as Muhammad has done compromise with us, we are okay with him. And then the story goes that Gabriel visited Prophet Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam, rebuking him, correcting him, telling him that you have attributed something to Allah, something to God Almighty, which doesn't come from him. And then 2 verses were revealed to him. Surah number 22, verse 52. Surah Al-Hajj, verse number 52 was revealed to him, to rebuke him. And also Surah Al-Isra, Surah number 17, verse number 72 to 3 were also revealed to him, to rebuke him. What is the conclusion of the story? Our friends, our Christian friends, they conclude, some of them, not all of them, they conclude from the story that Prophet cannot be a prophet of God, because he hasn't spoken from God. This is a revelation from devil, from Satan. So it cannot be from God. Therefore, he has spoken from other than God. Therefore, he is a false prophet. Second conclusion, cannot trust any Islamic scripture whatsoever. If once Satan is successful to interpolate, insert, add, then Satan can be successful on many other occasions. So how do we know what is from Satan and what is from God? Now the question is, where did the stories come from? Who narrated them? How do we know whether they are trustworthy? How do we know that they are reliable? They are reported by many Islamic sources, ladies and gentlemen. However, you have to keep this in mind. Not one of the Islamic sources which narrate this particular story are classified as authentic Islamic sources. These are the books of chronicles. We have categories in Islam of literature. The highest form of Islamic literature, Quran, the book of Allah. The best Arabic, the best expression. For example, the Arabs were stunned by the Quran. They were poets. They could express themselves in poetical form, in prose. وَأَحْسَنَ مِنْكَ لَمْ تَرَقَتُّ عَيْنِي وَأَجْمَلَ مِنْكَ لَمْ تَلِدِ النِّسَاءُ خُلِقْتَ مُبَرَّأً مِنْ كُلِّ عَيْبٍ كَأَنَّكَ قَدْ خُلِقْتَ كَمَا تَشَاءُ. This was their excellence. This is how they expressed themselves. So when the Quran was revealed, they were stunned. Amazing words. And literate man, so that is the highest form of Islamic literature, Quran. Second form of Islamic literature, the most authentic prophetic tradition. 6 books, Sahih Sitta, they are known as. 6 authentic. Bukhari, Muslim, Abu Dawud, Tirmidhi, Ibn Majah, and Nasai. These 6 books. Then comes the literature which is of lower degree, which has fabrications in them, which has weak narrations in them, and which also have authentic narrations in them. Then comes the literature of Maghazi, or the Seerah, the life of Prophet Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam. This literature has a lot of fabrications, a lot of da'if material, weak material, and authentic narration. Then come the books of history, the chronicles. So who narrates this story, ladies and gentlemen? Quran? No. Authentic 6 books? No. The lower degree than that? No. Chronicles, ladies and gentlemen, Islamic chronicles, which are full of other fabricated stories, which our Christian friends have forgotten to refer to. They have chosen this particular story because this somehow, in their opinion, harms the character of Prophet of Islam or raises doubts about his character. So let's examine the story. Ibn Ishaq, in his famous book of the biography of Prophet Muhammad, he narrated this story. Al-Waqidi, Ibn Sa'd, Al-Tabri, which is also a book of chronicle. Ibn Sa'd is a book of chronicle. Ibn Abi Hatim, Ibn al-Mundar, Ibn Mardawiyah, Musa bin Uqba, Abu Ma'ashir. Now, what is the trumpetter's role? Our Christian friends argue that why did these people narrate it if it's fabricated? They simply do not understand how the Islamic literature works. If our friends worked hard a little bit more, they would have realized that Islamic literature works in a different manner than the Christian literature. In the books of chronicles, not in the books of authentic prophetic tradition, which I mentioned in the beginning, 6 books, not in those. In the books of chronicles, the compilers collect information wherever they get it from, and they narrate it with the chains, and they wash their hands of it. They say, we are the collectors, we are the gatherers, the people who come after us, they are to examine the chains of narration and see which person is weak, which person is trustworthy, which person is authentic, and then based upon that you accept the report. So Tabari, in his book, he clarifies this, because Tabari is the biggest source our Christian friends use in this regard. So Tabari states, hence, if I mention in this book a report about some men of the past, which the reader or listener finds objectionable or worthy of censure, because he can see no aspect of truth, nor any factual substance therein, let him know that this is not to be attributed to us, but to those who transmitted it to us, and we have merely passed this on as it has been passed on to us. Tabari states this in volume 1, which was printed in Beirut. The story has many problems with it, ladies and gentlemen. The first primary source of Islam, the Quran, contradicts the story. The Quran is in contradiction with the story. So Quran is the most authentically preserved literature of Islam. If Quran contradicts the story, there's nothing left to it. Ironically, our friend today, David, is going to argue that this story is authentic. While on their websites or in the literature, they argue that Quran is not authentic. Quran isn't authentically transmitted to us. This story, a dubious story, which no Muslim scholar ever stated to be sahih. The word sahih literally means authentic. Not one Muslim scholar, and I challenge my friend today to produce one statement, to quote one hadith out of all of this literature, about which a Muslim scholar stated that this hadith, this particular report, is authentic. Where the satanic verses are mentioned, I challenge my friend. And the Quran, the entire Muslim world is unanimous that every single word of Quran is transmitted powerfully. Continuous bombardment of reports. But our friends argue otherwise. So there is a clear contradiction in approach. Our friends are arguing that this story, which is dubious, is authentic and Quran isn't. Okay. So Quran contradicts this passage. First of all, there are narrations of the Quran which directly contradict this story. For example, Surah number 60, verse 44, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala states, وَلَوْ تَقَوَّلَ عَلَيْنَا بَعْضَ الْأَكَاوِيلِ لَأَخَذْنَا مِنْهُ بِالْجَمِيلِ ثُمَّ لَقَطَعْنَا مِنْهُ الْوَتِينَ. If he, the messenger, were to invent any saying in our name, we should certainly have seized him by the right hand, and we should then have surely cut off his artery. Okay, Quran is clear saying if he invented something on our behalf, we'd never said we would punish him. Then, chapter 41, verse 42, لا يأته الباطل من بين يديه ومن خلفه. No falsehood can approach it from the front nor from the rear. The Quran, the contents are preserved. Then, chapter 15, verse 9, إِنَّا نَحْنُ نَزَّلْنَا الذِّكْرَ وَإِنَّا لَهُ لَحَافِظُونَ. We indeed have sent down the recital, the Quran, and we indeed are to protect it. These are the narrations. This story directly contradict, because in this story you find that Satan somehow interjected these verses. So even if we were to examine the verses which were revealed to rebuke Prophet Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam, to correct him in this regard, that you have attributed something to God, we see that there are clear contradictions. In the first passage, which is in chapter 17, verse number 73 to 75, it states, and this was revealed to rebuke the Prophet when satanic verses allegedly were entered into the Quran. Indeed, they were about to divert you from what we revealed to you, in order that you forge against us something else. And in that case, they would certainly have taken you as a friend. And had we not made you firm, you would have almost inclined towards them a little. And in that case, we would have made you taste the double punishment. Ladies and gentlemen, there are clear problems with this passage. In this passage, indeed they were about to divert you. The reports state that Satan did divert him. He put words in his mouth and he uttered them. The Quran is saying this very story goes against the argument of our friends. This particular verse is telling us explicitly that the story is not true, because it's saying indeed they were about to divert. If it applies to that case, this means that Satan was about to divert. If we apply to that case, we cannot apply to that case because the verse has nothing to do with that case. Then there are other problems. In this verse, it was the unbelievers who made attempts at inducing Prophet for compromise. In this particular verse, the context is that. But Prophet was, when we see the report, in the report Prophet was eager for compromise, contradiction. Allah made Prophet immune against such endeavors, so did not incline even a little according to the verse. But when we go to the report, Prophet not only leaned towards them, but even made compromise, violating fundamental teachings of Quran. In the verse, had Prophet been guilty of slight inclination, he would have been punished. But in the report, committed offense with full compromise, yet Allah became kind, silent repeat interpolation, affectionately consoled. Clear contradictions. And in this particular verse, the Arabic word, the word kadu. Kadu means they were about to do it, it was never done. So the verse is falsely attributed to this particular story. Internal evidence, when we examine the second verse, or the internal evidence of Surah 53, where the verses were interpreted, if we read it, it becomes even more absurd, ladies and gentlemen. Let me read the verse 19 of Surah 53 and continue and proceed from there, and then I will interpret the verses and you will see how absurd this is. Have you seen Lat and Uzza and other, the third, the Manat? And I will interpret the words now, the Satan allegedly interpreted in this chapter. These are the higher flying ones, whose intercession is to be hoped for. Interpolation unquoted, and then the verses continue, the real verses of the Quran. What for you, the male sex, and for him, the female? Behold, such will be indeed a division most unfair. These are nothing but names which ye have devised, ye and your fathers, for which Allah has sent down no authority. Ladies and gentlemen, just think about it. According to the story, the pagans of Quraysh, they were pleased with the story. They were happy, they prostrated. But in the verses, in the Quran, it seems that these deities which were mentioned in the verses by the Satan as highly flying cranes, they were insulted in the very two next verses. That these are the names which you forged. What does that mean? So is that what the pagans were happy about? No. So the story and the verses, when we interpret them in the Quran, they don't make sense. Proving further that it is a lie. Then, when we read the opening verses of the chapter, we realize that the story doesn't even make more sense. By the star when it goes down. These are the first verses of the very surah, very chapter. Verse number 50, chapter number 53 of the Quran. These are the first 4 verses. By the star when it goes down. Your companion Muhammad has neither gone astray, nor has erred. Nor does he speak of his own desire. Nor does he speak of it. In the story we are told that he desired to compromise. And the Satan interjected the words. And the very beginning of the surah is telling us he cannot be speaking from his desire. وَمَا يَنْطِقُ عَنِ الْهَوَىٰ إِنْ هُوَ إِلَّا وَحْيٌ يُوحَىٰ. He doesn't speak from his desire. He's speaking what is being revealed upon him. Amazing. And when we read from verse number 24 onwards, the story becomes even more absurd, because the entire surah is rebuking the disbelievers. It's telling them you're on the wrong path, you will end up in hellfire if you don't change. And then they prostrate with pleasure. Absurdity, ladies and gentlemen. Reports fail the test of genuineness. The criticism of Islam. The first criteria was Quran. We examined the verses, so-called satanic verses, with the Quran. Quran completely contradicts the story. Now we go on to the next criteria, the criteria of examining the sources, where these verses are coming from, who reported them. Are these people authentic according to the Islamic scholarship? Let's see. First, number 1, the hadith was reported by various narrations of the Mursal type, where the name of the companion or the second generation narrator is omitted. So one narrator is missing in the middle. The narrator who narrated from the Prophet is missing. We don't know whether he was a cat, we don't know whether he was a mouse, or duck, or a horse, or a man. No one. There's no one there. So is that an authentic narration? No. Because we have a link missing. First of all, to begin with, there are 7 Mursal narrations. Mursal means when a link is missing. And these narrations are not authentic according to entire Islamic corpus of literature. 3 of them are weak and 4 of them are authentically narrated to the person who are last in the chain. So the chain is authentic in 3 narrations, going to the person who is narrating on the top of the chain. I hope you're with me, all of you. It is a bit complicated. I have to address this issue in this way because this is Islamic literature. That's how it works. It is a bit complicated. It is Islamic science of hadith, and you have to be paying attention to it. So, for 3 narrations, the chain is authentically transmitted to the last man, but then a link is missing between the Prophet and the last man. So that's why we do not accept these reports, they are unauthentic. For example, Sayyid bin Jubair, he is one of the links. Abu Bakr bin Abdul Rahman bin Al-Harith, another link. Abu Aliya, another link. And Qatada. These are authentic links, but who they reported from, we don't know. Not known. Not known. Since no one knows the source of the hadith before these four, it cannot be considered authentic because the narrator is unknown. Note the later year of the death for all these four men. All of these four men died almost right at the end of the first century of Islam. So there is a gap between them and the Prophet for 90 years, ladies and gentlemen. Almost 90 years. Second, the narration that has continuous chain of narration reaching to Ibn Abbas has been reported through a weak and very weak chain of narration, all of which are not established. Some of the narrators are known to be liars. Some are known to be very, very weak, and some are not even known with regards to trustworthiness. Also, there are horrific contradictions between these narrations that invalidate the entire hadith narration. Ladies and gentlemen, these narrations are to be found in chronicles. They're not in the authentic literature of Islam. Can you see how powerful Islamic literature is? Even the Apocrypha of Muslims is well preserved. Our Apocrypha, we have chains. While the Christians, for their Bible, they have nothing, ladies and gentlemen. Matthew, Mark, Luke and John, who are they? Gospel according to Matthew, Gospel according to John, Gospel according to Luke, who are they? No change, no authentic transmission, manuscript tradition. 5,700 manuscripts in Greek, no two are similar. No two are similar according to Bar Ehrman and Bruce Metzger. Highest scholarship in this regard, in this particular field. So even our weak narrations have changed. For instance, the narration from Ibn Abbas through Abu Salih collected by Ibn Mardawiyah includes Al-Kalbi. This is for you, David, who said to Sufyan, every hadith I reported to you through Abu Salih is a lie. So the man himself was testifying that I've been narrating lies. There were many men who were caught red-handed by the Muslim caliphs. Harun al-Rashid caught one of the men. He interpolated, he lied 1,000 times on the Prophet. And he admitted his guilt. And he said to Harun al-Rashid, the caliph, that only I know which reports they are, to keep himself alive. Harun al-Rashid executed him as an apostate from Islam, and he told him that Abdullah bin Mubarak, Abu Ashab al-Fazari, those two people will narrate authentically from the Prophet, and they will separate lies from the truth. So we had a way of separating lies from truth, and that is the issue of science of hadith, which is another debate. Then Bazar also collected this hadith from Sayyid bin Jubair and Ibn Abbas, all weak narrations. Third, among the scholars who stated that the hadith is not authentic, this is for you, David, Ibn Khuzaymah, Bayhaqi, Al-Bukhari, Abu Bakr ibn al-Arabi, Al-Qadi al-Ayat, Fakhruddin Razi, Muhammad bin Yusuf al-Qaramani, Ibn Badruddin al-Aini, Ibn Kathir, Shawkani, Shihabuddin al-Alusi, Sadiq Hassan Khan, Muhammad Abdul, and finally Sheikh Albani. Sheikh Albani, the highest authority, highest contemporary authority on the hadith, on the science of hadith, he stated about this particular story, which is narrated from different multiple sources, and this narration does not have 13 narrators. David stated in one of the debates that it has 13 narrators. That is not true. David does not know what he's talking about in this regard, with due respect, because the narration doesn't have 13 narrators. Shaykh Albani said, تِلْكَ هِيَ رِوَايَةُ الْقِصَّةِ. For this narration, وَهِيَ كُلُّهَا, all of them, كَمَا رَأَيْتُ مُعِلَّةً, that all of them are weak, and the weakness are بِالْإِرْسَالِ, the link is missing, وَالضُّعَفْ, the weakness, wal-jahala, people are unknown. Therefore, these reports are all weak, where the satanic verses are mentioned. So, there are other problems with the verse, which I will come to address later on. My time has run out, and ladies and gentlemen, thank you very much for listening to me and being patient with me, and I am sorry if I said complicated things, but that's how Islamic science of these words. Thank you very much. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh.
Good morning. I'd like to thank Westbourne Park Baptist Church for hosting several of the debates in this series. I'd also like to thank Adnan for his opening statement and for agreeing to do a debate on the infamous Satanic verses. I know this isn't an issue that Muslims like to talk about a lot, but I think it's one of the most important issues we can consider when we investigate the reliability of Muhammad. I want to begin with a story about something that happened just a couple days ago here in the UK. I arrived on Thursday morning at Heathrow. My friends David and Jeff picked me up from the airport, and we decided to try and get some breakfast. We got lost, and when we got lost, we decided we had to ask for some directions. So we were looking around for a person who seemed reliable. And we saw someone, and I said, "Hey, there's former President Jimmy Carter." It wasn't Jimmy Carter, I was just saying the person looked like former President Jimmy Carter. So Jeff rolled down his window and said, "Excuse me, sir." And then the woman walked over, and we realized that it wasn't a sir after all. She did look like Jimmy Carter. Old age sometimes does that. But my point here is that sometimes we say things that are extremely embarrassing, and we were extremely embarrassed when Jeff said this. So we say very embarrassing things, and we wish that we could take them back. But we can't always do that. Sometimes we say them, and the damage is done. Now this can happen to anyone, even people who claim to be prophets. According to our earliest Muslim sources, when Muhammad was preaching in Mecca, he didn't win very many converts. But since he wouldn't stop condemning the religious beliefs of the people of Mecca, they began persecuting his followers. And as the suffering of the Muslims increased, Muhammad longed for a revelation from God that would make the Meccans happy and bring the persecution to an end. Then one day Muhammad got the revelation he was looking for. Adnan has already put them up, but since I have it on my slide, I'll put it up as well. The revelation said, "Have you not heard of Alat and Alusa and Manat, the third, the other? These are the exalted cranes whose intercession is to be hoped for." Now, according to the story, these words were originally part of Surah 53. They declared that in addition to Allah, there were three goddesses that Muslims could pray to: Alat, Alusa, and Manat. Muhammad delivered these words to his followers. He bowed down in honor of them, and his followers bowed down with him. The pagans were so overjoyed that Muhammad had spoken favorably of their gods, they bowed down too. And suddenly there was peace between the Muslims and the pagans. But a little later, Muhammad came back and said that these words, which he had delivered as part of the Quran, weren't really from God, they were from Satan. Now, I'm sure that Muhammad wished he had never delivered the Satanic verses. I'm sure that it was the most embarrassing moment of his career. But he did deliver them, and that can't be changed. Amazingly, the earliest Muslim historians recorded this incident. It's a monument to their honesty. They admitted something totally embarrassing about their prophet. Muslims have been trying to take it back ever since. And Adnan's opening statement is an excellent overview of how Muslims have tried, by any means necessary, to discredit one of the best established facts in Islamic history. But it's too late to take it back. In this debate, we're going to see that Muhammad did deliver the Satanic verses to his followers. We're going to see that Muslim apologists reject the evidence, not because the evidence fails, but because their faith in Muhammad prohibits them from going where the evidence points. And in the end, we're going to see that because of the Satanic verses, we cannot accept Muhammad as a prophet of God. Let's turn to the evidence. There are two primary ways we can investigate the authenticity of the Satanic verses. First, we can apply the method that historians use to investigate events, the historical method. Second, we can apply the method that Muslims use when they investigate Islamic history. It's not criticism. We'll apply both methods and see where the evidence points. Let's begin with the historical method. How would a historian, not a Muslim historian, how would a historian in general approach the Satanic verses? The first question a historian is going to ask is, what do our earliest biographical sources say? Generally, earlier reports are more reliable than later reports because later reports are more likely to be embellished or to reflect the biases of people who've passed on the story. So early testimony is extremely important, and we have to ask what the earliest Muslim historians said. Here we find that our earliest biographical records that we still have, such as Ibn Ishaq and Waqidi, do contain the Satanic verses. We also know that even earlier sources contain reports of the Satanic verses. So this isn't something that was invented late in Islamic history. That's all I'm saying now. This is not something that came much later. This is something that goes back to the 1st century of Islam. The next question a historian is going to ask is, how many sources are there? Is the story found in just one source, or do we find it in multiple historical reports? The idea here is that if we only have one source telling us that an event occurred, it's possible that someone made it up. But if we have multiple historical reports telling us the same thing, it seems unlikely that someone simply invented it. So when we investigate the Satanic verses, how many historical reports are we dealing with? 1 or 2? 5? 10? 15? 20? Do I hear 25? Anyone for 30? 35? We have around 37 historical reports of the Satanic verses. Adnan says, David says there are around 30. That's not true. Well, I anticipated this and I brought all 37 of them with me. So I have them all. If you'd like to examine them, I can send them all to you by email if you'd like to investigate them. We have around 37 reports of the Satanic verses. So, at this point, the historian is going to ask whether these sources are independent. That is, are a bunch of sources just copying from one other source. If that's the case, then even though you have a bunch of sources, you really only have one source, the original source that everyone else copied from. So how many independent sources do we have? Here the Isnaites, the chains of transmission, come in handy because Muslims often kept records of where they got their stories. Of the 37 sources we have for this story, 6 go back to Ka'b al-Arazi, one of Islam's greatest early scholars. 5 go back to Urwa ibn al-Zubair, an early Meccan scholar who's known as the founder of the study of the life of Muhammad. He was also Aisha's nephew, Abu Bakr's grandson, and the son of Abu Bakr's daughter Asma, one of the first 20 converts to Islam. Seems like someone who would be in a position to know what happened. 2 go back to Abu Bakr ibn Abdul Rahman ibn al-Harith, one of the top Islamic scholars during the 1st century. 5 go back to Abu al-Aliya al-Basri, another of the greatest Quranic scholars of the 1st century. He studied the Quran with Caliph Umar, Ubay ibn Ka'b, Zayd ibn Thabit, and Ibn Abbas. Those of you who know those names know who those people are. 2 go back to al-Sudi, another early scholar who studied with Ibn Abbas. 1 comes from the tafsir of Muhammad ibn al-Sa'id al-Qadi, an early commentator who composed the longest tafsir that had been written up until his time. 4 reports go back to Qatada ibn Zaman, one of Islam's greatest early commentators. 1 goes back to al-Tahaq ibn Muzahim al-Balqi, a 1st century expert in tafsir. 1 goes back to Ikrimah, a slave of Ibn Abbas and an expert on the life of Muhammad. We have 6 reports that go back to Ibn Abbas himself. We'll be discussing these more later. No one's going to question the reliability of Ibn Abbas. We have several that go back to Sa'id ibn Jubair, one of the leading Quranic scholars of his time, one of the top students of Ibn Abbas. Some of Ibn Abbas's narratives go through Sa'id ibn Jubair. It's clear then that we have numerous independent sources for the Satanic verses. Now, we just looked at the 3 main criteria a historian would use in evaluating the Satanic verses. We have early sources going back to the 1st century of Islam. We have multiple sources, somewhere in the neighborhood of 37. And we have independent sources, including a number of Islam's best 1st century historians and commentators. But we can go even further. Historians also apply principles such as the principle of embarrassment. The principle of embarrassment states that, as a general rule, dedicated followers of a religious leader don't invent embarrassing stories about their leader. If they're going to invent a story, it's going to be something positive. They're going to invent stories about the leader performing miracles or something of that nature. What this means is that there's no way a bunch of Muslims decided one day to invent a story about Muhammad delivering revelations from the devil. They would not have done that. And if, let's say, pagans or evil Jews had invented this story, there's no way the Muslim scholars and the Muslim historians are going to pass it on as if it's authentic. This makes sense, doesn't it? We can see then why non-Muslim scholars almost universally regard this event as indisputable. The great Oxford scholar Guillaume, for instance, says this: "It is impossible to suggest a motive that would induce the early Muslims to write such a story about the Prophet, unless it were true. If historical evidence is to be given any value, we must hold that Muhammad pronounced these words in the middle of Surah 53. And Montgomery Watt concludes, "Muhammad must have publicly recited the Satanic verses as part of the Quran. It is unthinkable that the story could have been invented by Muslims or foisted upon them by non-Muslims." Now, at this point, Muslims will usually say, "History schmistery. We looked at the isnads, and we don't like them," which means that we're going to reject this story regardless of how much historical evidence there is for it. We saw this in Adnan's opening statement. If you're not familiar with what Adnan is saying about the Muslim method of historical investigation, Muslims have stories about Muhammad, and those stories come with a list of names. I got this story from so-and-so, who got it from so-and-so, who got it from so-and-so, who got it from so-and-so. And then a later Muslim scholar will look at this list of names. And if he really likes all the people on this list and thinks they're all really good Muslims, really reliable people, then he'll look at all these names and say, all right, if I don't have any major objection to the story, then I'll put my stamp of approval on this and say that it's reliable. If the Muslim scholar doesn't like all the names on the list, he concludes that the story is false, or he rejects the story. And this is the standard Muslim excuse for rejecting all kinds of historical facts about Muhammad. But it's based on a complete misunderstanding of the proper application of Isnad criticism. In the early centuries of Islam, there were two broad categories of historical literature that are important in this debate. Adnan pointed out several categories. I'm going to focus on two. There was, on one hand, the Hadith literature, and on the other hand, there was the Sirah Maghazi literature. The Hadith literature consisted of sayings and deeds that define Muslim doctrine and practice. The Sirah Maghazi literature consisted of straightforward historical narratives. The emphasis wasn't on doctrine or practice, the emphasis was on providing a biography of Muhammad. So we have two different kinds of historical reports, and here's the key. These two kinds of literature had different methodologies. The Hadith scholars insisted on having complete isnads that go all the way back to a companion of Muhammad. The Sirah Maghazi scholars often gave abbreviated isnads, or they would simply appeal to a known authority on an issue. Sometimes they didn't include an isnad at all, just as historians of the world today do not include isnads. They had a different methodology. And here's the key, even the Hadith scholars understood this. Even the Hadith scholars understood that they had different methodologies. We read among the Hadith scholars, they'll say, oh, so-and-so, a reporter of Sirah literature, don't trust him with Hadith, but you can trust him with Sirah Maghazi literature. Now here's where the error comes in. The main reports of the Satanic verses are part of the Sirah Maghazi literature, which means that the reports should be judged based on the standards and methodology of the Sirah Maghazi scholars. Again, these are two different categories of historical reports. And so Muslims who reject the Satanic verses based on Hadith methodology are simply confused about the role of isnads in the Sirah Maghazi literature. When we examine the Satanic verses reports based on the standards of the Sirah Maghazi scholars, we find that the reports are completely reliable. Indeed, reports of the Satanic verses were accepted by the greatest of the Sirah scholars, Ibn Abi Hatim, Ibn al-Mundir, Ibn Mardaya, Musa ibn Uqba, Abu Mashar, and Asad al-Tabri. So if we judge these reports based on the type of literature they're actually contained in, the reports turn out to be just as solid as just about anything in the Sirah literature. But just for fun, let's go ahead and apply the standards of the Hadith scholars to the Satanic verses. Let me offer an isnad that goes back from Ibn Mardawiyah all the way back to Ibn Abbas. Now, this is a complete chain. Al-Suyuti said that it was made up of reliable transmitters, and it goes back to Ibn Abbas. But Muslims want to reject anything that refers to the Satanic verses. So what excuse do Muslims come up with to reject it? Well, even though all of these early guys are completely reliable, we don't know very much about Muhammad ibn Ali here. We don't have any reason to distrust him. There's nothing bad about him in the sources. But we just don't know a lot about him. So the Muslim concludes, since we don't really know a lot about this guy, the story must be false. Now, does that make sense? Does that mean that the story is false? No. The Muslim rejects it anyway. It's an interesting method of doing history. Let's look at another. Now, what's wrong with this is nothing. It goes back to Ibn Abbas, and everyone in this chain is reliable. So why don't Muslims accept it? Well, one of the scribes who passed on the report wrote a note saying that he didn't trust it. He didn't trust it for theological reasons. He just couldn't believe that Muhammad had delivered revelations from the devil. So the scribe wrote a note saying that he didn't trust the report, and Muslim scholars from then on said, aha, here you have it. There's a note saying someone didn't trust it. Let's throw out the report. It must be false, despite the fact that the chain is sound. My friends, Muslims will look for any excuse to reject reports of the Satanic verses. They ask for isnads. I'm not a fan of this method, but we offer them isnads, and they reject the isnads anyway. But there are other sources we need to consider. Adnan said that there are no Sahih chains, but he agreed that there are Sahih Mursal chains. We have a number of Sahih Mursal reports. Sahih meaning that we can trust everyone in the chain, and Mursal meaning that it doesn't go all the way back to a companion of Muhammad. But here we have to ask, who do these Sahih Mursal reports go back to? Do they go back to people who were in a position, who were in a good position to know what actually happened? Well, we have two Sahih Mursal chains. They go back to Sa'id ibn Jubair, who again was one of the top students of Ibn Abbas. We have two Sahih Mursal chains that go back to Abu Bakr ibn Abdul Rahman ibn al-Harith, one of Islam's greatest first century scholars. We have four Sahih Mursal chains that go back to Abu Aliyah al-Basri, who again studied with Caliph Umar, Ubay ibn Ka'b, Zayd ibn Thabit, and Ibn Abbas. Since the chains of transmission are reliable according to the standards of the Hadith scholars, we know that these guys were teaching that Muhammad delivered the Satanic verses. But here Muslims say, well, the companion isn't listed in the Isnad, therefore the story is false. But let's examine this response more closely. Three of your earliest scholars, people who knew the companions, were teaching independently that Muhammad delivered the Satanic verses. Were they lying? Were they simply fools? What were they? If you're going to tell me that your earliest scholars were a bunch of liars or a bunch of fools, how can we know anything about Muhammad? If we're talking about Sahih al-Bukhari, for instance, and all the false narrations that he had to deal with, well, that was 200 years after the events. If the first century of Islamic scholars were either fools passing on bad information, or they were inventing false tales about Muhammad, how can we trust anything that came from the first century? But we can trust later people. Wait a minute, all your information had to go through that first century. And if your earliest people are a bunch of liars, how can we know anything about Muhammad? So if you want to reject these sources, I have to say, I'm going to find it difficult to trust anything in your sources. But there's an even bigger problem here if you reject the Satanic verses. You see, Muslim scholars have a method of examining Sahih Mursal reports. Tons of Muslim scholars don't agree. But we do have a method, and I think it's a reasonable one. According to Ibn Taymiyyah, if we have multiple Sahih Mursal reports of an event, we have to accept the event, because there's no way several different Muslims would have invented the same false story. That seems very reasonable to me. So according to Ibn Taymiyyah, we have to accept the Satanic verses, and Ibn Taymiyyah himself believed that the Satanic verses reports were authentic. Now, I'm not sure about this, but I heard that Adnan is a Salafi. Who is Salafi? Okay, I'll take that as a yes. So I'll just go ahead and ask, did Ibn Taymiyyah have a sound method of examining reports? I don't know who Ibn Taymiyyah is. He's sort of the granddaddy of all Salafis. So did he have a sound method of investigating reports? If you say yes, you have to accept the Satanic verses, because that's what his methodology declared. If you say no, his methodology was flawed. He did not know how to investigate historical reports. Why in the world are you a Salafi? If Ibn Taymiyyah, Shaykh al-Islam, didn't know what he was doing when he was investigating these things and coming to his conclusions, how can you trust his views? We can see then that even if we apply the strict standards of Hadith scholars, we still have a lot of information to deal with here. There's simply no reasonable way to reject these accounts. But Adnan disagrees, and he's offered several reasons for rejecting the Satanic verses. Let's take a look at his arguments. He says that Muslim scholars reject the events, and he gave a long list of later people who said, these stories are false. So he says that we should reject the Satanic verses because Muslim scholars, and of course Muslim scholars today reject the Satanic verses, most of them. Well, this presupposes that these Muslim scholars who reject it were objective and unbiased in their investigation. And I'd say they're clearly not. And by the way, I could just as quickly point out that non-Muslim scholars almost universally accept this event as indisputable. But that wouldn't prove much. I have to point out, though, that even though Muslim scholars reject the Satanic verses now, the earliest Muslim scholars accepted the Satanic verses. So please give me some people from the first century who rejected the Satanic verses, because I gave you a long list of first century scholars who accepted it. Now, do you know the real reason that Muslim scholars reject the Satanic verses? During the 2nd century of Islam, Muslim scholars modified the doctrine of God's protection of the prophets. The doctrine came to mean in the 2nd century that prophets are infallible when they transmit revelation. This was not the 1st century position. So when this doctrine became the orthodox position in the 2nd century, Muslim scholars began rejecting reports of the Satanic verses, despite the fact that the 1st century scholars accepted the Satanic verses as a fact of history. So Muslim scholars from the 2nd century on rejected the story for theological reasons, not for historical reasons. They had to come up with historical excuses to reject the story, but their motivation was theological in nature. But this debate isn't about Islamic theology, it's about history, and history shows that Muhammad delivered the Satanic verses. Adnan says that the isnads are unsound. Since not one of these sources is classified as an authentic source. Well, that depends on who you go to. If you go to Ibn Taymiyyah, for instance, he respects Sahih Mursal reports. Ibn Taymiyyah respects the ability of the early Muslim scholars to transmit information. Ibn Taymiyyah is not going to say, all our 1st century guys are a bunch of liars. He's not willing to do that. He takes these reports seriously. And besides, I offer 2 chains that go back to Ibn Abbas, and I show that the reasons Muslims have offered for rejecting these reports are simply absurd. And no non-Muslim who's not desperate to reject these sources would ever reject them. And it says that the reports contradict each other. One says that Muhammad wanted a compromise. One says that the pagans made him an offer to compromise. But first of all, that's not a contradiction. If the pagans say, hey, quick, say something nice about our gods and we'll be friends with you, that can lead to temptation. So this sort of thing isn't a contradiction. We do. We have all sorts of these things in the multiple reports that we have. Some of the stories say that Muhammad delivered the Satanic verses because he loved the people of Quraysh. Some say that he wanted to end the persecution. Some say that he just got tired one day and delivered the Satanic verses. Now, these aren't actual contradictions either, because it's possible that all of these are correct. But there are differences, and some of the reports do contradict the others. But again, this doesn't show that the reports are false. If anything, it shows that the reports are true. Because we know that the early Muslim scholars were doing everything in their power to try to rescue Muhammad from guilt in this matter. That's why they were saying, it's because of his great love that he fell for this trick. It's because he wanted to end the persecution of his people. So they're coming up with a positive spin on these stories. And you have all sorts of variations in different Muslims trying to rescue Muhammad from guilt in this matter. And of course you have these sorts of differences. Does that mean that the reports are false? Of course not. You have massive differences in Sahih al-Bukhari. You open Sahih al-Bukhari, you say Muhammad died when he was 63. You turn the page, it says he died when he was 60. You turn the next page, it says that he was in Mecca for 10 years. You turn the next page, it says he was in Mecca for 13 years. Do you throw out all Sahih al-Bukhari? Do you conclude that since there's discrepancies in the account of Muhammad's death, that therefore he didn't die? No, of course not. You say there are problems in the details. There are problems in the details, but the core is correct. And if we have 37 reports with differences in the details, all right, say there's a problem in the details, but don't say this is a reason for rejecting it all. If you do, be consistent. Say you have to throw out Sahih al-Bukhari as well. Now, Adnan did have some other objections. I'm about out of time. Okay. All right, so we'll look at these in a moment.
Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim. David claimed in his presentation that Ibn Taymiyyah accepted it. He never produced any statement by Ibn Taymiyyah. Listen to this now. This is what Ibn Taymiyyah said. The words that say, these are the high Gharaniq, it was not the Prophet who said them, but the devil threw these words in their ears. The ears of the disbelievers. Ibn Taymiyyah, Al-Fatawa 282. So David, Ibn Taymiyyah did not accept this story as you claim he did. Okay. Now, I saved it for this time. I let David speak, and now we know the reality of these reports. Why the Muslim scholars rejected them. David himself, in fact, exposed his approach to this topic. He said he has 37 reports with him, which means he has studied them, he knows them, and he knows what they contain. Then he gave you 10 sources of those 37 reports, contradicting himself. 37 reports, multiple reports, then 10 sources of them. What's the problem here? You see, every single of those reports is in contradiction itself. For example, the reports collectively, when you see them all together, that's what they come up to. Each version differs from other in essential and material respects, in major details, ladies and gentlemen. Occasion of the incident. Prophet was in some reports, Prophet at Kaaba, he was praying at Kaaba with companions. Other reports, he was talking to unbelievers. And the surah came. Then other report, surah was already revealed, and some disbelievers already listened to it. Others say that the disbelievers came to Prophet Muhammad ﷺ and they said to him, compromise with us, and then we will sit with you, and the outcomers, the newcomers, they will see us sitting with you and they will be impressed. Which one do you prefer? Then nature of alleged uttering of satanic verses. The alleged nature. What did they say? What is the Satan saying? Now, on the blogs and on the websites, when you go there, you find that David and his friends deliberately chose those reports which state that Satan put the words in Prophet's mouth. Are there any other reports in these particular reports? David said he's got 37 reports there. So he should know them. He must have studied them. Let's see what they say. Some reports state Satan threw these verses and Prophet thought Gabriel brought them. Some reports state Prophet uttered intentionally to soften Quraysh. Some reports say Prophet uttered it in mistake. Some say Prophet uttered them intentionally with notes of interrogation signifying denial. Some state Prophet uttered them no mention of reason or influence. Some state Satan himself imitated Prophet's voice and uttered them, and the disbelievers heard these words. Prophet never uttered them. Some state neither Prophet nor Satan uttered them but a disbeliever from the crowd of disbelievers who were present there, he uttered them. These are the details you never find on their blogs and the websites. Why do you choose the reports where Prophet is alleged to have heard these verses from the Satan and said them? While there are other reports which are saying, in the same corpus, in the same literature, 37 reports, David said he knows them, where stated that Prophet never uttered them, a disbeliever said it, or Satan imitated the voice of Prophet and he said it. Why don't you put them on your blogs and on the websites and tell the people these reports are also there? They're also there, but you never put them up. So there is a deliberate attempt to undermine the status of Prophet of Islam. There is picking and choosing. And this is not an objective approach to the whole topic, this is a subjective approach. So, the effect or sequel of the narration is all coming to us from different sources. When you study the contents, every single report, ladies and gentlemen, is contradicting the other in details. All 37 of them, all the reports, all 10 sources he gave. This is why the scholars of Islam reject the entire report system altogether. They said this is all lies. Because one report is not sahih. First of all, David did not give us one statement by one Islamic scholar where he said that these reports are sahih. Ladies and gentlemen, we have reports about brushing our teeth, putting our shoes on, washing ourselves, and every single report we have statements by the scholar, sahih, 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 authentic, authentic, authentic. This report, nothing. David has nothing to produce. Instead, he used a criteria which I call MPE, multiple attachment. And then principle of embarrassment. And then early attachments. Early, David said early sources are most authentic one. Gospel of Thomas, according to Marvin May, in this book, Nag Hammadi Scriptures, goes even earlier than the Synoptic Gospels. Gospel of Thomas, according to a scholar of Nag Hammadi Scriptures, who is the highest authority of Nag Hammadi Scriptures, Gospel of Thomas states James is the successor of Christ, not Peter. And Gospel of Thomas says that Jesus said that if you see a man who is born, if you want to see God, then go to someone who is not born of a woman. Go to someone who is not born of a woman. Meaning, someone who is born of a woman cannot be God. That applies to Jesus as well. He was born of a woman. Gospel of Thomas telling you directly that Jesus is not God. He's born of a woman. Earliest source of Christians. Double standards. Objective approach rejected and subjective approach adopted. Okay. Origin of the story. There are many mixed statements about this, ladies and gentlemen, that where the story originates from. Many people are lying. David said 5, 10, 20, 30 to shock you. Guess what, ladies and gentlemen? There are reports within Islamic literature, listen to me carefully now, within the Islamic literature, which state that Quran had 17,000 verses. The present Quran has got 6,000 verses. But this report is stating, multiply attested, from many sources with a chain. More than 37 chains, ladies and gentlemen. How many chains do you think this report has? 10? 5? 20? 30? 50? 100? 500? Guess. For this particular report, within Islamic literature, where Quran is interpreted, Quran has 17,000 verses, Quran has 20,000 verses, Quran has been tampered with by the Sahaba and so on. 2,000 reports, ladies and gentlemen, within Islamic literature. Does David accept them? Does Dr. Watt accept them? Montgomery Watt, he quoted to have said that he accepted this verse. And he said, no non-Muslim scholars accept this. That's not true as well, ladies and gentlemen. John Burton, a well-respected scholar of Quran, he rejected these reports as fabrication. John Burton, not a Muslim. He studied the history of Islam and he said these reports are fabricated. Montgomery Watt accepted the Quran which we have today is essentially Uthmanic recension. It came from Uthman, at least. We're happy with that. Uthman is a companion of the Prophet. Do the Christians have that privilege? Synoptic Gospels, where do they come from? Early attestations, do we have them? 5,700 manuscripts, every single of them contradictory in contents, different contents. Which one is true? Which one is true word of God? Apply the same criteria to yourselves. The science of hadith, ladies and gentlemen, is an extensive topic in itself. David is trying to confuse you with the science of hadith, and he's trying to 37 reports. As I said, there are 2,000 reports. There are reports in Islamic literature. I'm sorry to say these words, but because the topic is about the science of hadith, you have to know this. There are reports in Islamic literature. There's a book called Bihar al-Anwar, 110 volumes of hadith. In there are reports that Prophet Muhammad, before he used to sleep, he used to put his face in the breast of Fatima, his daughter. Do you believe that? Does any non-Muslim scholar believe that? Is there any element of truth in that? No. Multiply tested, changed according to your criteria of embarrassment. Who is inventing these lies to help Prophet? Are Muslims inventing these lies? That Prophet used to put his face in the chest of Fatima? Are Muslims doing this to help the Prophet? Your own criteria is going against you. Early test, I've already stated. Now, David's approach, ladies and gentlemen, to the whole issue is flawed, in my opinion. And David said that the earliest sources of Islam say that. This is a misrepresentation of Islamic sources. All the sources are 4th or 5th in category, ladies and gentlemen, as I stated in my statement. And the early sources, look at this list. And the list goes on. There are earlier than all the sources David mentioned. There are 59 early sources I have documented, and David does not know about them. If he knew, he would have said that there are earlier sources of Islam than these which are there. But David said these are early sources mentioned them. Earlier sources don't mention these reports. These are later interpretations, later fabrications. That's why a line or the whole list of Islamic scholars rejected them. Even Ibn Taymiyyah, which he brought by himself, I quoted, rejected the reports. So ladies and gentlemen, who's right and who's wrong? We have to see the approach, the objectivity, whether David and his party or his friends are objective in this whole issue or not. So, David must answer these questions. I have 7 questions for him. Why he does not accept explanation given as to the story's origin. Because it's a fabrication, it's a later report. 2. Why he fails to understand difference between transmitters and evaluators, and how some historians use this story to vindicate the Prophet receiving revelations from the God through Jibreel. If David accepts the story to be authentic, then he also accepts that Jibreel came to Prophet. Gabriel came to Prophet with revelation. Do you accept that? You accept the satanic bit, but you reject the other one. Why?
Time's like that.
Thank you very much, ladies and gentlemen.
In my opening statement, I showed that the historical method, the method that historians use to investigate events, confirms the authenticity of the Satanic verses. I appealed to early testimony, to multiple independent sources, and to the fact that these are embarrassing admissions that no Muslim in good standing is going to invent. And if one did, he would be pointed out. This is not something that multiple Muslims across the Muslim empire are going to invent independently. That would be nonsense. So these are the criteria that are exactly the sort of things that historians are going to look for when they investigate the Satanic verses. So how did Adnan respond? Well, he criticized me and said that I said that all non-Muslim historians accept this event. No, I didn't. I said almost universal, which is true. It's almost universal. And by the way, I would say the reverse of Islam. It's almost universal that Muslim scholars reject this, but it's by no means universal. Shahab Ahmed, for instance, a Muslim scholar at Harvard University, accepts these early reports and says this goes back to the earliest history of Islam. Much of what I've said is based on his research. He says I contradicted myself because I said there are 37 reports, but then there are only 10. No, I distinguish between multiple sources, having a bunch of sources quoted in this book, quoted in this book, quoted in that book, and sources that can be traced back to the same person. So you have different sources saying that Ibn Abbas, there are different chains of transmission saying that this story goes back to Ibn Abbas, there are 6. But I said in one sense that would qualify as one source, Ibn Abbas, even though you have multiple sources saying that he said it. So I clarified that. I don't see where the confusion arose. He said that the reports contradict each other, therefore they should be rejected. Well, I already addressed this. If you're going to do that, you have to throw out Sahih al-Bukhari. You have to throw out everything. You have to throw out all of your hadith, because you always find contradictions. Again, I pointed out we have contradictions in the age of Muhammad. We have contradictions in how long Muhammad was in Mecca, right there in the same passages in al-Bukhari. So do you throw out these passages? Do you reject the entire story of Muhammad dying? Of course not. Adnan asked for consistency. He would never apply that method to the hadith. So why does he apply it to the Sirah Maghazi literature? Because you have to. You have to be inconsistent if you're going to reject these reports. He says there are reports saying that the Quran has 17,000 verses. Do I accept them? Well, I think it's pretty likely that the Quran originally contained much more than we have today. Indeed. Umar's son, Ibn Umar, said this: "Let not one of you say that you have memorized all of the Quran, for how can he say that he knows it all if so much of it has been lost?" So we have from Ibn Umar that much of the Quran has been lost, and so why shouldn't there have been originally 17,000 verses? He says, well, the Gospel of Thomas is the earliest Christian source. Yes, you could find 2 or 3 people on the planet willing to say that, but no one said that. In fact, I was at the conference about 3 years ago where it was proven conclusively that whoever wrote the Gospel of Thomas drew on the Diatessaron written around 160. So it comes after 160. And it definitely shows Gnostic influence in the pages. There's no way the Gospel of Thomas came from the 1st century. That's the consensus of scholars. Yes, you can find a fringe view. I can find a scholar who says Muhammad never existed. Does that make that scholar right? No, you go with the majority of what scholars say. He says that early sources don't report the satanic verses. He has earlier sources. I'm not sure what he means. If he means he has earlier biographies, which is what I was referring to, show me some biographies that are earlier than Ibn Asad. I'd love to read them. I know of them. I know things that you can quote that there were original sources that we don't have. We might have pieces of them. But besides that, I took these reports all the way back to the 1st century. I took these back to people who studied with Ibn Abbas and Caliph Umar and Zayd ibn Thabit. Who was he? These guys who compiled the Quran. These are people who are right there studying with the companions, and they're the ones reporting the satanic verses. Are you saying they're liars? It sounds like that's what Adnan's saying. All these 1st century Muslims were a bunch of liars. Again, I would just ask, how can you trust anything? Go to the Hadith. Go to Sahih al-Bukhari. You'll find these same people in transmissions going into al-Bukhari. If they're a bunch of liars, how can you trust any of them? You're stuck with that. If you want to reject the satanic verses, you have to say these early Muslims were a bunch of liars. All right, you have to live with the consequences, though. Don't tell me you know anything about your prophet. Next, I argue that Muslims are misapplying the method of Isnad criticism because the most important reports of the satanic verses are contained in the Sirah Maghazi literature, and so it only makes sense to examine the narratives according to the standards of the Sirah Maghazi literature. When we do this, we find that the reports are reliable. How did Adnan respond? He just went right ahead with his method and ignored this. He's acting like the method of the Hadith scholars was the only method. Look, I said this before. Even the Hadith scholars understood that they had a different methodology from the Sirah Maghazi scholars. Now, just because later Muslims chose one over the other, that doesn't mean that the earliest Sirah Maghazi transmitters were unreliable. Even the Hadith scholars said, yes, they are reliable when they transmit this biographical material. So, apparently Adnan knows more than even the Hadith scholars that he appeals to. Finally, I show that even when we apply the methodology of the Hadith scholars, we still find that the reports are reliable. We have reliable isnads going back to Ibn Abbas, and Muslims have no good reasons for rejecting these. They come up with some excuses, but not good reasons. We also have multiple Sahih Mursal reports, and according to Ibn Taymiyyah, Shaykh al-Islam, when we have multiple Sahih Mursal reports of an event, we should accept the event as historical. Now, according to Adnan, Shaykh al-Islam, Ibn Taymiyyah, rejected the reports of the satanic verses, and he believed that Satan had just put them in the words of Muhammad. I have a passage right here from Ibn Taymiyyah. We can look at it later. We can all gather around out there. We can all read it together, where Ibn Taymiyyah appealed to this event as evidence that Muhammad was a prophet. He said, if Muhammad were a prophet, he would have just stuck what he said and would have admitted that he'd fallen into error. But he admitted that he had fallen into error. This showed that he was a true prophet. So Ibn Taymiyyah admitted that Muhammad said that he had fallen into error. So Ibn Taymiyyah's position was not that Muhammad was innocent of this matter. His position was that Muhammad recited these verses himself. He says that I deliberately choose statements that say Muhammad that Muhammad recited the verses, and I never quote the reports saying that Satan said them, and this is a deliberate distortion. No, it's not. It's a simple fact that all of the reports that go back to the first century, 100% of the reports that go back to the first century say that Muhammad said them. It's only in the next 50 years after that first century that you start getting these variations that no, Satan said them and he disguised his voice to sound like Muhammad. This was an obvious attempt by later Muslims to exonerate Muhammad. So if I'm going to examine this openly, who am I going to go with? Am I going to go with all the people from the first century whose position on this was unanimous? Or am I going to go with later Muslims who are obviously trying to rescue Muhammad? Muslims obviously want to go with the later people who rescue Muhammad. I don't share that methodology. I go with the earliest scholars, just as historians do. So it's clear that my entire case for the authenticity of the Satanic verses narratives is still standing. No matter how we examine the early Muslim sources, we have to accept the Satanic verses as authentic. Now, Adnan has given some arguments that I didn't get to address earlier. For instance, he said that the Quran contradicts these events. Since the Quran says that Muhammad couldn't go into error, the prophets do not go into error, therefore Muhammad could never have delivered the Satanic verses. Now, Adnan certainly is misinterpreting Surah 17, 73 through 75. Well, I can see why he would interpret it that way, but the point is that's not how the early Muslims interpreted it. When God says that he wouldn't let Muhammad go astray, how Ibn Taymiyyah interpreted it and how the first century Muslims interpreted this was that God is not going to allow Muhammad to persist in error. So Muhammad might mess up, and God is going to come in there and keep him from persisting in that error. That was the position. It wasn't until the 2nd century, when they came up and the Muslims modified the doctrine of God's protection of the prophets, that Muslims said, no, prophets can't go into error at all. But that's not the first century position. That's not the position of the early commentators. That's not the position of the early Muslim scholars. That doesn't come about until later. So what am I going to go with? Later conclusions that are based on theology, or the earlier people who aren't basing their positions on theology, they're basing it on what they know about Muhammad that was in the memory of the early Muslim community. I think the answer is very clear. Now, as far as this contradicting the Quran, no, this fits in perfectly with the Quran. Let me read to you from Surah 22. This came about as a result of the Satanic verses. Allah says, and we did not send before you any apostle or prophet, but when he desired, Satan made a suggestion respecting his desire. So you desire, and then Satan casts it on your desire. But Allah annuls that which Satan casts. Then does Allah establish his communications, and Allah is knowing why. So Satan casts something. Now I'm sure Adnan would say, well, that shows that God takes it away and doesn't allow it to happen. Wrong. Keep reading. It says, so that he may make what the Satan casts a trial for those in whose hearts is a disease and those whose hearts are hard. And most surely the unjust are in great opposition. So God allows prophets to deliver messages from the devil to test people. You can't say this is something that God stops before it ever gets to the prophet, or it will be a test. It has to get to the people if it's going to function as a test. So according to this passage, which came about, this was Muhammad's. This was God's answer when Muhammad needed to be comforted. God said, don't worry about Muhammad. All prophets deliver revelations from the devil from time to time. Maybe comforting to Muhammad, not comforting to me. Now just think about this in the last few seconds. I have more respect for the early Muslim historians and commentators than Muslims do. I have more respect for the people, the Muslims. I have more faith in their reliability to pass on knowledge than Muslims do. I have more respect for the methodology of Ibn Taymiyyah, Shaykh al-Islam, than a Salafi debater does. I am the one defending the ability of Muslims to tell us about their prophet. And who's telling us, no, don't trust him, don't trust Ibn Taymiyyah, don't trust anything? Muslims are telling us this. Well, that's fine if you want to go that route, but it's the same thing we find when Muslims investigate Christianity. Ignore all the evidence. Reject it in any way possible. And then we turn to Islam, we go to the same, Christians use the same method, we go to the earliest sources, we see what they say, and we find Muslims doing the same thing. Don't listen to that. Don't listen to that. Listen to later things that we like. If you're comfortable with that, that's on you. As for me, I'm going to stick with the same methodology. I'm going to go with what the earliest commentators say, And I do that with Christianity, I do it with Islam. And you see the conclusions that happen when we follow this method. And you see why Muslims have to reject it. Because
right, I'll read the question as it's addressed to the person being asked, and he will have 2 minutes to answer, and then the other person will have a minute to respond. His first question is for Adnan. But this is the only question for Adnan so far, so there's more in that list I've just been given. What are Islam's views about Satan in general, his origin, what he's able or not able to do, etc.? I am trying to find out on the basis of what is believed about Satan's powers. Is then such an event conceivable? Is that clear?
Thank you very much, Paul. Bismillah. The conception about Satan in Islam. Satan is a jinn. Allah says in the Quran, "Kana min al-jinn." He's a devil, meaning he's not an angel. Satan is not an angel, number one. Number two, he's asked Allah, God Almighty, قَالَ رَبِّي فَأَنذِرْنِي إِلَى يَوْمِ يُبْعَثُونَ. Oh my Lord, grant me respite until the day of judgment. And Allah, God Almighty, said to him, إِنَّكَ مُنذَرِينَ, you are respited, to be a test for the mankind. So Satan does not have capacity or capability, according to the entire Islamic literature, to misguide a prophet. Quran, the whole of Quran, logically it goes against the whole of Quran. These satanic verses in themselves. The whole Quran talks about Tawheed, the message of monotheism. Logically, if you look at the Quran carefully, and then some Satan comes in and interprets these verses and prophets put them out. This is obnoxious, even to think about this. Doesn't make sense, logically. So, for this reason, the scholars rejected these reports, and Satan is certainly not capable, according to the entire literature of Islam, to do something like this. Thank you very much.
Adnan says that Satan just can't do this, that it's totally inconsistent with what Islam teaches. Again, I quoted in the Quran, which is saying that this happens to prophets all the time. This happens to all of God's prophets, that Satan casts a desire when they desire something. The only way to even try to go around this is to say that God stops it before the prophet does anything. But you can't say that, because the very next verse says that God does this as a test to test people. So the prophet must deliver this passage, these revelations from Satan, to the people, so that this can be a test. And this is exactly what we find in the Satanic verses. This is where this passage in the Quran arose from. So we certainly find this in the Quran, and this is consistent with the Quranic position.
Okay. Next question is for David. You said you have multiple sources, and on that basis you say it is not invented. The question then is why you don't believe in the Quran as an authentic source, when we have more than your multiple sources, including today's science, which agrees with most of the scientific facts mentioned in the Quran.
I think this is related to something that Adnan brought up. He says, well, if you're saying we have multiple sources, and you believe that these guys were reliable transmitters of these stories about Muhammad, why don't you believe that the Quran has been reliably transmitted? I do believe that the Quran has been reliably transmitted. I trust those people who are transmitting the Quran too. I don't think that it was perfectly transmitted. The evidence certainly shows that that's not the case. But I don't believe that the Satanic verses narratives were perfectly transmitted either. So I'm perfectly consistent. And I'd say that it's Muslims who are being inconsistent when they assume that the people passing on the Quran are 100% infallible, reliable people, and the people passing on the other stories that they don't like are complete morons and fools, and they just can't get anything right. These were your earliest scholars. The Quran was being passed on among the same people that the stories of the Satanic verses were being passed on among. So, were they reliable or were they not reliable? I say they were generally reliable. They were human. So they made mistakes, but I think they were in general reliable. There was one comment about the science in the Quran. I just refer you to Surah 1886, which says the sun sets in a pool of murky water, and you can go out west and find the place, and there are people living there. That's where the sun goes down. All sorts of things like that in the Quran. So if anyone would like to debate that, I'd be happy to do it. But that's certainly not the case.
Multiple sources. David said that we go with the majority when he discussed the issue of Gospel of Thomas. When it comes to this report, Satanic verses, we go with the minority. Ibn Taymiyyah, even though he said that this report is not the way David put it, he said it was the devil who said this. But still, David will stick to Ibn Taymiyyah and reject Ibn Khuzaymah, Al-Baddad, Ibn Kathir, Nawaz Siddiq Khan, Shawkani, Albani, all the majority of Islam. We don't go with the majority in this case, because Prophet Muhammad is the one who is being spoken against him. So, Quran, as far as Quran is concerned, ladies and gentlemen, this is a clear exposure of David and his party that they accept a fabricated hadith from the literature of Islam because it somehow, in their opinion, hurts the character of the Prophet of Islam, and they reject the Quran to be authentic. If you go to their websites and see, to be authentic because it goes in favor of Islam. Thank you very much.
Thank you everyone for your questions. We've got more than enough now, so thank you very much. This question is obviously written by a scholar. Forgive my pronunciation of all these Arab names, I'll try my best. It's to Adnan, and I'll show you the question as well because my Arabic is non-existent. Omar ibn al-Zubayr, the foremost scholar of the first Islamic century and the nephew to Aisha, included the Satanic verses in his compilation. Do you claim to know better than Omar and also other first century Muslim authorities such as, and I will pronounce them because I can't, but I will show you both the question.
Urwa bin Zubair, Sayyid bin Jubair, Abdullah bin Abbas, ladies and gentlemen, none of these people were eyewitnesses. And David kept referring to these reports as Mursal Sahih, Mursal Sahih. There is no such a thing known as Mursal Sahih in the entire literature of Islam. It is laughable. So it shows us how much David and his friends need to learn about Islamic literature and how Islamic literature works. So Urwa bin Zubair, Sayyid bin Jubair, these early people, if they report something, it doesn't mean that it's correct, because the reports can be falsely attributed to them. This is why the link is missing. Well, if the link was there, we could have told, we would be able to tell whether the report is authentic or not. David himself has accepted by the fact of mentioning Ibn Abbas, that Ibn Abbas is the only man where the link is found. Thank you, David, for mentioning that. What is the point of mentioning that? Because Ibn Abbas was a companion of the Prophet, so he's a link between Prophet and the coming generation. But even that report, ladies and gentlemen, is extremely weak, as I gave you the sources already. So, if the link is missing, the report is utterly rejected by Islamic scholarship for the right reasons. So, there is very, very clear evidence available to conclude this. Thank you very much.
As far as the Sahih Mursal reports go, the point of saying Sahih, which is what the text I have said, the point of saying Sahih is to say every person on this chain is a reliable transmitter. True, it doesn't go back to the reports, and that's why you add Mursal. But we do have reliable chains where every person in the link is reliable, going back to someone other than a companion. Now let's just consider some of the people these reports go back to. I think the question was about Urwa ibn al-Zubair, who again was Aisha's nephew, Abu Bakr's grandson, and the son of Abu Bakr's daughter Asma. Who was Asma? She was one of the earliest converts to Islam. If you want to know if this report were true, all he has to do is go say, "Hey mom, did this happen?" If he wants to know if it's true, all he has to do is go ask Ibn Abbas. These people were in the community, so to say that they were just inventing these stories in the early Muslim community, and we know they were teaching these things, to say that they were just inventing them sounds so absurd to me. But if you're a Muslim, you have to say that. You have to say, anyone who disagrees with my view, they're a bunch of liars. I'm not willing to say that. I'm not willing to say that. Again, I trust the early Muslim scholars more than Muslims do.
Question for David. Hundreds of earlier sources say, including the companions of the Prophet Muhammad, that Prophet Muhammad received revelation from God. Using your own logic, are we going to say they are all liars when they said the Prophet received revelation? You have more respect and in their reliability right, as you said. Excuse the grammar.
Yes. All right, so I accept reports saying that Muhammad delivered revelations from the devil. Why don't I accept reports saying that Muhammad delivered revelations from God? Well, I'm investigating this historically. Were those verses actually from the devil? I don't know. I can't determine that. What I can determine historically is that Muhammad claimed that these verses which he had delivered were from the devil. And if your prophet is saying that, you have to certainly agree with it. If you know that he's saying it, you have to agree that he was receiving his revelations from the devil. I look at it and say, all right, what do I know about Muhammad? I know he didn't know where these revelations were coming from. Could they be from the devil? Sure. Could they be from his own mind? I think so. So, what we can establish historically is that Muhammad claimed that he delivered these verses from the devil. I think we can also conclude historically that Muhammad was claiming, I'm absolutely certain of this, that Muhammad was claiming that he received revelations from God. Can we determine that they're from God? Can we determine that they're from the devil? We have to look to other methodologies to do this. But we can, and this is the point, we can, using the historical method, determine what was being claimed in the early Muslim community. And yes, there are all sorts of claims that Muhammad was speaking for God. That's what scholars believe. And at the same time, there was this report of Muhammad, on this occasion, out of weakness, delivering a revelation from the devil. So, I'm consistent here. I accept that this is what the early Muslims were teaching about Muhammad when it's good. That's what they believed. Is it true or not? No. I think it's not, definitely, when we investigate these things. But I'm consistent. I follow this. I look at these transmitters. I say they're both reliable. And we can know what the early Muslims were teaching about Muhammad.
Ladies and gentlemen, this exposes the approach of David Wood. He doesn't accept when they say it's a revelation from God. He accepts when they say in this particular report, allegedly, that it is from Satan. David Wood, in one of his articles, contrary to what the Quran suggests, not all of God's messengers were occasional puppets of Satan. We know one at least who had complete authority over Satan. And the devil was terrified by his presence. Jesus, he referred to in his article. Listen to this, ladies and gentlemen. And Jesus, being full of the Holy Ghost, returned from Jordan and was led by the Spirit into the wilderness, being 40 days tempted of the devil. Thank you very much.
A question for Adnan. A prophet is a man inspired by God, but as he is not God himself, he will have flaws. Do you believe a prophet is without flaws, though he is human like all of us?
It's a very good question. Thank you very much. A prophet is a man inspired by God, but as he is not God himself, he may be infallible. A prophet is a human being. He is infallible. When it comes to daily affairs, his own life, he can make mistakes. But when it comes to revelation or delivering the message, he's absolutely infallible. He's ma'soom. He's free from any fault. Jesus in the Bible is, on a number of times, he said to the Pharisees, "You vipers, you adulterous generation." He was hungry, he cursed the tree. This is infallibility. This is fallibility. But when he gave the message of God, he was infallible. When he said, "Hear, O Israel, the Lord our God is one God. Worship the Father, the only true God." These statements are infallible. But his statements when he said, "You adulterous generation, you vipers," these statements are not infallible. Thank you very much.
I agree that true prophets are infallible when they deliver revelation from God. Which is why when we turn to the Satanic verses, accounts, I think we have outstanding evidence that Muhammad was a false prophet. So certainly Christians would agree that the prophets were fallible. When we look at David, when we look at Solomon, certainly they were fallible. But there's something quite different about falling out of weakness into promoting polytheism and committing shirk. That's what Muhammad did. And that's something no other prophet has ever done.
I'm running out of questions for David, but I have tons for Adnan now, so we're around at the moment. We've got, I think, how long have we got? 10 minutes left?
Yeah.
Right, okay. Okay, I will make this is the last question. Can you, it's a question addressed to Adnan, and I think it applies to both. Can you clarify Ibn Taymiyyah's position on this?
David is insisting again and again that Ibn Taymiyyah accepted the report, yet he hasn't produced one statement where Ibn Taymiyyah said that this report is authentic, where Satan put the words in Prophet's tongue or in his mind. Not once David gave us a statement by Ibn Taymiyyah, and he's saying, come back to me afterwards. This is a debate, it's been filmed, it's going to be public. Produce the statement. I produce the statement and I produce it again. Ibn Taymiyyah said, the words that say, these are the high Barani, it was not to the Prophet. It was not the Prophet who said them, but the devil threw these words in the ears of the disbelievers. Al-Fatawa, Volume 2, page 282. Thank you very much.
I have the passage from Ibn Taymiyyah right here. In fact, on the page before, he specifically rejects the view that Adnan is attributing to him. In this passage, he says, for surely, talking about Muhammad delivering these verses, and using this as an argument for the reliability of Muhammad, he says, for surely, if Muhammad enjoined that something be done, and then enjoined something else that contradicted it, claiming that both commands are from God, and then considered as veracious in that, then when it said of his own volition that the second and abrogating command was from God, and that the thing that was being removed was and abrogated by God was not from God, this is an even greater proof of his purposing veracity and of his speaking the truth. So when Muhammad delivers these things, he says they're both from God, and then comes back and says, no, the last one was from God, and the former one was from Satan. This is proof that he's seeking after truth. A false prophet would never admit that he's wrong. This is Ibn Taymiyyah.
Thank you, David. Now each speaker will have an opportunity to give a 5-minute speech to round up and conclude their points. Thank you. Adnan, do you want to go first?
Bismillah, thank you very much. David not once gave us one statement by any Islamic scholar who said this report is sahih. He said 37 reports, 10 sources. I gave him 2,000 reports about the Quran. The Quran is interpreted, 17,000 verses. So and so lied, this one lied, that one lied. There are 186 scriptures of hadith, ladies and gentlemen. There are 186 scriptures of hadith. 1 million hadith. 1 million hadith. And only 60,000 of them are authentically reported. Majority of them, 90% of the hadith literature is untrustworthy according to Islamic literature. People say the Bible was attacked. No, Quran was attacked, ladies and gentlemen, all the way through the history. There are reports, thousands of them, multiply attested, many reporters, many sources, going back to early sources of Islam. Even in the first century, they are obnoxious, 17,000 verses of Quran. Who's going to accept that? Who's going to accept that? Even the non-Muslim scholars, they just throw it away. They don't want to know. It's not trustworthy. So you haven't given us one statement by any scholar, even though you claim Ibn Taymiyyah, you just read him. It doesn't prove nothing. Ibn Taymiyyah, what I read, clearly stated that Muhammad ﷺ was not the one who uttered these words. It was the devil who threw these words, and the kuffar heard them. The disbelievers heard these words. So David, you have actually not produced any evidence in this regard. Ibn Umar said, David claimed that most of the Quran is lost. I will give David £10,000. Anytime he can approach me after this debate, I'm saying on the video, if he can produce one report that Ibn Umar said these words, that most of the Quran was lost. Most of the Quran was lost. I'm going to say it again. £10,000 for David, if he can produce this from any literature. You go with the majority. Sira Maghazi criteria, again, self-appointed or self-concocted criteria of David, that Sira Maghazi criteria is different than the Hadith criteria. And then he brings Ibn Taymiyyah. Ibn Taymiyyah was a scholar of Hadith. He was not a scholar of Sira Maghazi. Why did you bring him to attest the case, to confirm your case, or to substantiate your case that this story is true? When Ibn Taymiyyah was a scholar of Hadith, and he commented on this based upon the Hadith criteria. Again, problems. So ladies and gentlemen, in conclusion, Satanic verses logically do not make sense. Historically, they do not make sense. If we apply the Islamic criteria to them, it doesn't make sense. The entire Islamic corpus, there is not one scholar in the entire history of Islam who said that these reports are sahih, they are authentic. The debate, the topic, the title of the debate, Satanic verses, fabricated or authentic. The word for authentic in Arabic is sahih. David Wood has failed to produce one statement by any Islamic scholar from the entire history of Islam to state that this story is sahih or authentic. Instead, he's bringing this source, that source. We have many reports like that in Islamic literature. You're going to bring all of them to prove the Quran is wrong? Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam used to sleep with his daughter. Ali used to sleep between Aisha and Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam. There are reports like that. Who's going to believe that? Were the Muslims forging themselves these reports? Or they were the hypocrites who were forging these reports? Can you imagine a Muslim forging this report that Ali used to sleep between Aisha and Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam? Can you imagine that? Logically, ladies and gentlemen, it doesn't make sense. It logically doesn't make sense. So I conclude that David today has failed to produce any solid evidence in this regard, and I have given you evidence from the Islamic literature. Historically, I've proven to you that MPE approach is flawed. And then I gave you the statements by Ibn Taymiyyah and even John Burton, a Christian scholar or a non-Muslim scholar. He stated that these stories are false, they are fabricated. Thank you very much for listening to me.
In this debate, we've seen that all of the available evidence we have declares that Muhammad delivered the Satanic verses to his followers. Whether we apply the historical method or Islam criticism, if we're honest, we have to admit that this story is authentic. And that says I'm inconsistent because I go with the minority. Well, it would be the minority of Muslim scholars. Today, it would be the majority of Muslim scholars in the first century, and it would be the majority of non-Muslim scholars now. So, I am going with the majority. I'm just going with the majority that seems less biased in this case. He says, I accept the report saying that the verses were from Satan, but not that Muhammad got these from got revelations from God. I already clarified that. My position is we can establish what was being claimed. We have a different methodology if we want to confirm whether something is from Satan or from God. He says, Jesus was tempted by the devil. Now think about this. Jesus faced Satan and won a complete victory over him. Satan fled in the end. And Adnan somehow thinks that this is like Muhammad delivering revelations from the devil to his followers and promoting polytheism. Are these the same? I don't see how. He says, I gave no report that a scholar deemed Sahih. Well, we have the Sahih Mursal reports, but the reason that later Muslim scholars would not deem these reports Sahih, and again, I gave some chains to go back to Ibn Abbas, and I showed the absurd excuses that Muslims give for rejecting these sources. What? Why are they rejecting it? Because the doctrine of the protection of the prophets, that a prophet can never go into error, became the orthodox position. And so, of course, the orthodox scholars are never going to accept this account. But they're rejecting it based on their theology, not based on historical investigation. He says that Ibn Taymiyyah didn't go with this. Again, yes, he did. If you want to say Ibn Taymiyyah was inconsistent, I would accept that. But his methodology of going with an event, if you have multiple Sahih Mursal reports, he has to go with it. That's his methodology. And we've seen in my quotation that was his position. He says, I said that Ibn Umar said that most of the Quran has been lost. Ibn Umar said that much of the Quran has been lost. There is a difference. He says, why do I appeal to Ibn Taymiyyah? Because I'm debating a Salafi. I have to pick and choose who I'm going to appeal to, because later on I'm debating Yahya, who's a Shia. I have to use different sources. If I'm debating a person who supposedly respects Ibn Taymiyyah, then I'm going to use that scholar. So, if we reject the satanic verses, we have to say several things. We have to say that the historical method, the method that historians use to investigate events, means nothing to us. We have to say that 37 historical reports of an event are meaningless. We have to say that the first century Muslim scholars were either liars or they were completely irresponsible. If we say either one, how can we know anything about Muhammad? We have to say, in effect, that we don't care what the evidence tells us. We don't care what Ibn Taymiyyah's method is. We're just going to believe whatever makes us feel good. I can't say that. And I'm sure that many of you in here can't say that. Now, for those of us who are interested in evidence and are willing to go where it points, we can draw three conclusions. First, Muhammad wasn't sinless. Surah 4, 116 says that shirk is the worst possible sin. Associating partners with Allah is the worst thing anyone could ever do. In this debate, what have we seen? What did Muhammad do? According to Muslim sources, he associated 3 goddesses with Allah. This is shirk. And not only did he do this, he promoted it among his followers. Second, Muhammad couldn't tell the difference between a revelation from God and a revelation from Satan. How can we trust the only prophet in history to deliver revelations to his followers, to bow down and honor them, and then to come back and say, the devil made me do it? Third, since Muhammad delivered the satanic verses, I'd say we have a decisive proof that he was a false prophet. Here's why. Muhammad said that the Torah was revealed by God. In Sunan Abu Dawud, Muhammad put his hand on a copy of the Torah and swore that it was from God. So we know he's referring to the text. In the text of the Torah is Deuteronomy 18:20, which says that any prophet who delivers a revelation that does not come from God or who promotes polytheism is a false prophet who must be killed. My friends, Muslims say that they respect Moses. If you respect Moses, you should think about this. If Muhammad had delivered the satanic verses in the time of Moses, Moses would have commanded people to pick up stones and stone him to death as a false prophet. So, if you can believe this consistently, that's on you. But as for anyone who loves God and hates shirk, you cannot accept Muhammad as a prophet of God. Turn to the Lord Jesus Christ, my friends, and receive salvation. Al-Masih al-Din.
Ladies and gentlemen, thank you very much for your presence. I have a gift for David. It's a book called Legacy of Islam, what Islam did for the world, and the result Islam produced for the entire universe. And this is a gesture of friendship between me and David.